Christian hope begins where all other hope stands frozen stiff before the face of the unspeakable. So we have the resources in our churches to respond not with denial, but with discipleship. But the question is, what kind of discipleship? That is the topic of tonight's webinar. Now, we're keenly aware that this particular assessment of the historic moment that we're in is still very much on the margins of our churches. So we're consciously, in this webinar, trying to build a case rather than assume it. We're working to make this argument in a way that can be understood and embraced by as many Christian folk as possible. Over the last 4 years here at BCM, we've been kind of thinking out loud through a series of events. We've hosted 4 Watershed seminaries in order to try to build this perspective. In February 2010, we held a seminar on the forest martyrs. That was the 5th anniversary of the martyrdom of Sister Dorothy Stang in the rainforests of Brazil. Then in February 2011, we did an institute entitled Healing Rivers, Hydrology Meets Theology and Bible Meets Bioregion. In July 2012, in our first summer institute, we looked more hands-on at practices of bioregional discipleship and permaculture. We've also, over these same years, been a part of a number of strategic conversations around North America that have explored the fairly new tradition of anarcho-primitivism and civilization-critical perspectives. Tim and Charlita hosted one of these in Chicago. Jay Beck, who's on this webinar, hosted one of these in Philadelphia. Our most recent institute just last month was entitled Coming into the Watershed, Permaculture, Eco-Literacy, and Bioregional Discipleship. And several folks here in the room were part of that. Our aim of this institute was to provide a general introduction to 3 key practical concepts, by which we mean concepts that cannot be separated from the practices by which they are defined. And those 3 were permaculture, eco-literacy, and bioregionalism. We are persuaded that together these form the basis for the only sustainable way forward for our weary planet. So all of these gatherings, including this one, are part of a broader initiative which will include a Watershed Discipleship Roundtable next week in Maryland, as well as some networking we're doing with the Mennonite denomination. Some of these folks are on the webinar tonight, and others, of course, around the country doing similar things. Now, we want to focus on the phrase that was the center of our concentration last month, and that is the phrase, coming into the watershed. This is a phrase and an idea that comes from Gary Snyder, a famous beat poet and the most widely known bard of the ecology movement. It's the title of an essay that had a huge impact on me when I first encountered it 20 years ago. The usual focus of attention for most Americans, writes Snyder, is the human society with its problems and its successes, its icons and its symbols. With the exception of most Native Americans and a few non-natives who have given their hearts to the place, the land we all live on is simply taken for granted. And proper relationship to it is not usually assumed to be part of proper citizenship. But after 2 centuries of national history, people are beginning to wake up and notice that the United States and Canada and Ireland are all part of a landscape with a severe, spectacular, spacey, wildly demanding, and ecstatic narrative that we must learn. Its natural communities are each unique, and each of us, whether we like it or not, in the city or the countryside, live in one of them. When enough people get that picture, our political life will begin to change. And it will be the beginning of the next phase of American life, coming to live on Turtle Island. When I read that 20 years ago, I felt like it spoke to my condition, as Quakers like to say. And this began a process for me of trying to reconnect with the landscape I was living on, but as with most of us, not necessarily in, much less into. Now, Gary Snyder's notion of coming into a place is a little bit prepositionally awkward. But the preposition is intentional in his literature, and we find an interesting echo in Mark's prologue that we worked with some depth at the Institute last month. The same preposition, into, is used in refrain in Mark chapter 1, verses 9 to 12. Mark tells us that everyone coming to John the Baptist in the wilderness was baptized in the River Jordan, but Jesus was baptized into the Jordan. I love this ancient icon, Ethiopian icon of the fish swimming toward Jesus as if he's becoming one with their habitat. But that's not all. When that wild bird descends, he descends into or onto Jesus. Same preposition in Greek, eis. And right after this, the Spirit drives Jesus deeper into the wilderness. So, while we usually focus on the baptism of Jesus as Jesus' empowerment through the Spirit's descent from above, we need to realize that these prepositions are trying to get us to see that he's also being empowered through a very deep and full spiritual immersion into his beloved homeland, from below, so to speak. These prepositions articulate that before launching his campaign of healing and proclamation and resistance to the principalities and powers that would define his life, Jesus sought to be grounded. He begins not with a consciousness of alienation, focusing on what he's against, but rather an experience of identification, focusing on what he is for, what he is part of, and what he seeks to defend. The land of his people, through which God has spoken for generations. So, baptism in wild spaces, I believe, is a ritual of what we might call coming into the watershed. Now, Gary Snyder, the poet, uses the venerable baptismal language of being born again to describe the conversion that must happen to all of us in relationship to the places we live. Encountering the idea of coming into a place intensified for me 20 years ago what I was already internalizing through reading the more well-known work of Kentucky farmer Wendell Berry, the foremost Christian voice addressing placelessness, the plague of placelessness in North America. For decades, Berry has pressed a diagnosis of our pathology of displacement as people. As he puts it, in modern globalized capitalism, one must never think of any place as one's home, or any place as somebody else's home. This was certainly my experience, has been my experience as a fifth-generation Californian. The fragile chaparral and oak savanna landscapes of Southern California are etched into my soul. But I have seen too much of the land I love relentlessly bulldozed, paved over, and disfigured into condominiums. This place has been systematically destroyed and mercilessly exploited by resorts, suburban tracts, boutique wineries, trophy homes, golf courses, military-industrial complexes, and all other manner of development, most of which has been spearheaded by the type of people Wendell Berry talks about, transplanted people who are in pursuit of a fantasy of profit or corporate interests. It has been one of the great continuing sadnesses of my life, causing me to be homesick in my home place. My work with indigenous people in the early 80s also had impressed me with the fact that people of place were always fighting for something, not just against it. Yet I was the product of an alienating culture where most of our activism was being against stuff because we couldn't articulate what we loved enough to try to save, or maybe even die for. So began a long journey that has been both personal and political to reconnect with my home place, to undergo my own process of what we call replacement, a metaphor of resisting placelessness by coming into a place. All of our peace and justice commitments remain, but this is a journey of the heart. Over the last 20 years, I've tried to find theological grounding to this work of coming into this bioregion, of the challenge of being born again, that according to Gary Snyder faces all of us. Obviously, the where of replacement becomes paramount. Where we are really talking about, argued Doug Eberle in his groundbreaking 1993 book, Boundaries of Home, is a new way of mapping reality. And I would add that this is both an outward journey, it's political, it's social, it's ecological, but also an inward journey. It's psychic, it's spiritual, it's theological. We have lost our way as creatures of God's biosphere, and the only map that will do is the one that is woven into creation. That's the one that will lead us home. That's the radical nature of this paradigm.
So we've come to believe that this old, new tradition of bioregionalism holds the key to the next great renewal of the church, in light of, not in spite of, the environmental crisis. So our project is to advocate that Christians replace ourselves and our tradition in a fundamentally bioregional paradigm. Kirkpatrick Sale's 1985 introduction to the concept defined bioregionalism in this way. Bio is from the Greek word for forms of life, and region is from the Latin regere, territory to be ruled. They convey together a life territory, a place defined by its life forms, its topography and its biota, rather than by human dictates. A region covered by nature, not by legislature. And if the concept initially strikes us as strange, that may perhaps only be a measure of how distant we have become from the wisdom it conveys. But we can be even more specific in our mapping of home. For within bioregions, the most natural definition of a place is the way that water flows. John Wesley Powell, the first non-native person to raft down the Colorado River in the 1860s, defined a watershed like this: that area of land, a bounded hydrologic system within which all living things are inextricably linked by their common watercourse, and where, as humans settled, simple logic demanded that they become a part of this community. So a watershed is an entire area, both water and land, that is drained by a watercourse and its tributaries into a particular body of water, such as a pond or a lake or an ocean. And it is made up of a unique mix of habitats that influence each other, including forests and wetlands, fields and meadows, rivers and lakes, and farms and cities and towns. So to understand the practical nature of this paradigm, it helps to focus on what is most basic to life, and that is water. Wherever we reside, whether it's in the city or the suburbs or rural areas, our place is deeply intertwined within a larger system called a watershed. So all of us live in a watershed, no matter how ignorant we may be about it. And frankly, most of us, certainly in North America, are. Watersheds come in all sizes. The Mississippi Basin is the third largest watershed in the world, and it drains the 41% of the lower 48 US states into the Gulf of Mexico. Or watersheds can be as small as your neighborhood. The map that you see in front of you is of the major watersheds in the US. And notice that they are not contained by any of the state borders that we humans have imposed. There are 2,110 watersheds in the continental US. And of course, every single one of us lives in one of them. So we've decided to push watershed discipleship as a framing slogan, because thoughtful sound bites are one way to help animate movements of change. And we really do hope that some of you will pick it up as a way of spreading the core practical concepts of this movement. Tim Knopfseeger, who you've seen up here helping us out, he has put up a website, which we hope all of you will begin using.
Now, one of the reasons we like the phrase watershed discipleship and why we're pushing it so hard is that it's an intentional triple entendre. This is the Webster's dictionary. In the first instance, obviously, watershed refers to the bioregional locus of the incarnational Christian following of Jesus. It's the watershed that Elaine's just been talking about. In the second instance, it acknowledges that the ecological end game that is stalking our history puts us in a watershed moment that demands serious, sustained engagement. As we began this presentation simply stipulating, both our love for the Creator and the interlocking crises of global warming, peak everything, and widening ecological degradation should compel us to make environmental justice and sustainability integral to everything we do as Christian disciples, and for that matter, as inhabitants of specific places. Thirdly, and one of our friends from New Mexico pointed out that watershed discipleship also means becoming a disciple of a place. It invokes this idea, but how do we do that? Here, discipleship is descriptive of the journey of learning, of following, of learning to trust the places we call home. So the challenge here, as we like to say, is that we simply will not save places we do not love. And Southern California is full of testimony to that. But we cannot love places that we do not know. So ignorance is not a victimless crime. Literacy is important. And we do not know places that we haven't learned. Now, we learned this slogan from a local chaparral biologist here in the valley. But Tim Knopfseeger discovered that it has a deep history. It represents a paraphrase of an argument made way back in 1968 by the Senegalese environmentalist Baba Dioum, who said in a speech to the General Assembly of the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, "In the end, we will conserve only what we love, we will love only what we understand, and we will understand only what we are taught." So we feel that these three truisms articulate the essential challenge facing all of us as we come to terms with the deep roots of our ecological crisis.
Brock Dolman is a permaculturist in Northern California, and he suggests that in order to save this planet, we all need to think more fundamentally in terms of watersheds. He writes this: "Watersheds underlie all human endeavors and form the foundation for all future aspirations and survival. The idea is one of a cradle or a container, as water flows over land, collecting into a river, and sometimes making its way to the ocean." So Dolan illustrates a watershed by cupping his hands like this. So rain or snow hits the ridges or the high places, and it either flows into our watershed or it flows into the neighboring one. And every living organism within this basin is interconnected and dependent on each other's health. Our cupped hands can also look like a boat, and we should absolutely think of our watersheds as our lifeboat. Dolman calls this the Basin of Relations, suggesting that if we all just figure out how to take care of our particular watershed, there is some hope. Dolman goes on to say that watersheds are where we can have social, local, intentional community with other life forms and inanimate processes, like the fire cycle and the hydrological cycle. For a community to have regenerative settlement patterns, we'd better figure out the water cycle and the fire cycle. Dolman continues, watersheds should embody the geographic scale of applied sustainability, which must be regenerative because we are desperately in need of making up for lost time. We are perched on the tipping point of a watershed moment. Now is the time to bring our communities together to set in motion plans and processes that ensure all watersheds will remain healthy in perpetuity. Your home basin of relations is your lifeboat.
So we want to ask, what would it mean if we were to transfer our deepest loyalties to the part of creation in which we live, in which everything is understood ultimately in terms of environmental sustainability? We think the church would lose nothing theologically by becoming replaced in this way. We are simply trumping all human claims to sovereignty with the ground of God's creation, which we are called in Genesis 1 to serve and preserve. And practically speaking, focusing on watershed-based strategies seem the best approach to transition living, which is current ecological shorthand for how everything must change. Now, we think that watershed discipleship will involve a number of things, such as figuring out ways to replace our theology, our spirituality, and our practices. We think it is going to demand ecological rereadings of Scripture because we haven't done a very good job of that in our churches. And we need to imagine what a watershed ecclesiology might be. So, for example, one of the things that our friends at the Abundant Table are doing is trying to think how to localize the liturgy. How do we, the elements of bread and wine that we use in the church, where do they come from? Do we know where they come from? Are they local? How can those symbols become more alive to us? Now, thinking this way is not an attempt to escape from hard political issues. Daniel Kemmis is an important voice in bioregional economics and politics. He believes that an understanding of place-centered social planning could transform our public life and urges us to return to a re-inhabitory politics, which rediscovers the power that arises from the efforts of unlike people to live well in a common place. This gentleman was the mayor of Missoula, Montana for many years. But a very specific example of a political expression of bioregionalism is in the question, how do we apply restorative justice? And so Elaine's going to walk us briefly through the case of our local watershed here.
Mm-hmm. I've been working in the field of restorative justice for the last 24 years, and most of my work has been in the criminal justice system, bringing victims and offenders together in face-to-face meetings or doing work in prison. When Chad and I moved up here about 8 years ago, and as we became acquainted with the beautiful Ventura River watershed and its inhabitants, I began thinking about how could principles of restorative justice be applied to voiceless victims of ecological degradation. And of course, we live right beside a good case in point, the Ventura River and its struggling inhabitants. Now, the Ventura River is one of the only major Southern California rivers that is not contained by long cement walls. You see here the picture up to the left. This is the Los Angeles River, for example. The Ventura River is mostly unchanneled, and it is still an intact river, which means that the water flows from its headwaters in the Los Padres National Forest all the way down to the Pacific Ocean. The river has several tributaries, including Matilaja Creek, San Antonio Creek, Coyote Creek, and Cañada Larga Creek. And when there is water in this river, it teems with bird life. Ducks, snowy egrets, the great blue heron. This is, of course, hard to believe right now because it is bone dry. And from our perspective, where we live, we have not seen that river flow for almost 2 years. Old-timers in our neighborhood say that the river used to flow year-round. But now, for the most part of the year, the river is dry. And that is due to damming and diversion. There are many critical issues that this river faces, so tonight I will only point out 2 of the most harmful actions that have been done to this watershed. Now I'm speaking again in terms of restorative justice, and I would call that the building of the Matilaja Dam was a harmful action to the Ventura River. In 1948, over many objections and reservations, construction of the Matilaja Dam was completed. This dam is located approximately 16 miles north of the Pacific Ocean, and its stated purpose was water storage and flood control. But even from its conceptual stage, it was not clear that the dam would serve these ends. And both of these objectives soon became obsolete because the dam quickly filled with sediment. And currently there are 6 million cubic yards of sediment trapped behind this dam. And what became painfully clear soon after the completion of the dam were several consequential environmental tragedies. When a violation happens between people, restorative justice seeks to provide opportunities for victims to be heard and tell of the impact of the crime, for offenders to be held accountable and to work to repair those harms, and for the larger community to figure out how can we prevent these violations from happening in the future. And so we ask 3 basic questions. Who was harmed by the violation? What are their needs? And whose obligation is it to meet those needs? So when you're dealing with a community of 10 people responding to a violation that happened on the street, that is one thing. But I think when it comes to environmental violations, we can ask these same questions. So question number 1, who was harmed by the construction of the Matilaja Dam? Tonight, I only have time to mention 4 victim groups, but there are many, many more. So 1, the southern steelhead trout. They were once abundant and widespread in the coastal rivers and streams of Southern California. Scientists consider the southern steelhead a genetically distinct fish species and the parent of all steelhead on the Pacific coast. In 1940, the steelhead population of the Ventura River was estimated at over 5,000. But by August of 1997, southern steelhead were declared an endangered species. The southern steelhead are an anadromous fish, which means that they migrate from fresh water to the ocean and then back up, journeying up the river to spawn in fresh water. The Matilaja Dam obstructs 85% of their existing habitat and traditional spawning grounds, which has caused a disastrous decline of steelhead fisheries, not to mention the loss of other crucial riparian habitat. So juvenile steelhead that are trying to make their way downstream are hindered by low flows in the river and then get trapped in the pools that inevitably dry up. The second victims are other endangered species. By preventing the passage of these ocean-going fish, 23 other species which are dependent on the steelhead are now also of special concern. 9 are endangered, 2 are threatened, and 2 are already under full protection. So this includes the ringtail cat, the California condor, the red-legged frog, and the brown pelican. Making fish able to return to their historic breeding waters in the upper watershed would greatly enhance the opportunity for restored habitat for these other species. The third victim is our beaches. An important function of rivers running to the ocean is to replenish the beaches with sand and rocks. Decades worth of sediment, once destined to become beach sand, lie trapped behind the many dams in California rivers. Since 1948, sediment intended for Ventura beaches has been accumulating behind Matilaha Dam. And as I mentioned earlier, there is currently 6 million cubic yards of sediment trapped behind the dam. And this has not only resulted in erosion of our beaches, and now we're hauling in sand from other places, but the water storage capacity of that Matilaha Reserve is now below 10% and is predicted to have zero storage capacity by 2020. And lastly, the fourth victim that I'll mention is the landscape itself. This is a picture of Hanging Rock, a Ventura County landmark that was submerged by 1952 as the Matilaha Reservoir slowly filled with water. The Hanging Rock of Matilaha Canyon was enjoyed for decades by residents and visitors. Historical photos reveal that it did survive the blasting that was done to construct the dam, but it now lies buried beneath half a century of silt deposits behind the dam. The second question of restorative justice asks, now whose obligation is it to address these harms and needs? There are a number of local groups working together to protect the Ventura River and its watershed. These community groups and coalitions are committed to the environmental restoration of the Ventura River, particularly the removal of Matilaha Dam. They've been working for years to remove this dam against extreme resistance. And at this point, most experts would agree that the dam is serving no beneficial purpose. There are fears, and real fears, about flooding and water control, and then there is the very contentious issue of where and how the 6 million cubic feet of silt will be disposed of. There is, however, wide public support for the removal of this dam. This is a creative and courageous graffiti artist made a statement 2 years ago, and it has never been removed by the authorities. And just quickly, a second major issue facing the Ventura River and much of Southern California is the introduction of non-native invasive plants. So our watershed in particular is overgrown with arundo. And this is a cane plant from India, and it grows to about 6 feet tall, and it just sucks up the water from our watershed. There have been several different arundo removal projects that have worked to control the cane in the upper and lower parts of the river. The removal process is painstakingly slow, and it's very costly, but it has resulted in dramatic increase in water flow. So arundo and dam removal are concrete examples of restorative justice initiatives to ecological degradation. And for me, as the restorative justice field becomes a broader and deeper discipline, it is important to see how it applies to the natural world as well as to the social one. So tonight, we have invited a number of guests who are going to describe the restorative justice initiatives either that churches are doing or organizations or individuals that are trying to address this ecological degradation?
We're going to invite Chris Grataski to enable his microphone and video, and Tim, you'll help us with that. Before Chris comes on,
Or as he comes on.
just we're going to have to go back and forth with the speakers here. What you've just gotten online in here is a sort of a 40-minute thumbnail sketch of an entire long weekend that we spent looking at Watershed Discipleship. To give you a little bit of an idea of the approach. In the second half of this webinar now, we're going to have some of the participants of that institute talk a little bit about what they are currently doing. Joining us here, you see him on the screen. Chris Grataski is coming to us from Lynchburg, Virginia. Chris is a practicing permaculturist, and he was a co-presenter last month. Chris, I want to ask you to talk a little bit about the upcoming plan as part of our ongoing campaign to run what we think might be the first specifically Christian permaculture design certificate course out here, right here on this campus in April of next year. Can you talk a little bit about how essential permacultural practices are to the kind of watershed discipleship we're talking about?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah, cool. So, yeah, I'm really excited about what we're pursuing together, and I feel like the practices, the approach, the paradigm of permaculture design is indispensable to what we're calling watershed discipleship. I think it offers sort of an ensemble of practices, and on-the-ground practices and approach to the disciplines of re-inhabitation, the disciplines of restoration, the disciplines of benevolent care and concern for the non-human others upon which we depend. I think these are the sorts of things in the field of permaculture design that really would constitute the harmonious reintegration of humans into the landscape. I really think of it as a way beyond a simply abstracted or an intellectually held sense of theological conviction about care for the earth, and really takes us more into the sort of self-emptying, the kenotic disciplines of what it means to be a disciple of Jesus. And I also would say that much of these concerns, while they arise out, or these practices, while they arise out of a conviction, simply out of what is beautiful, good, and true, what it is that we ought to be doing, that criterion for the shape of human life turns out to be much of what we need in this unprecedented historic crisis that we find ourselves in.
So talk a little bit about the PDC upcoming.
Right. So I feel like the PDC is structured in such a way that it offers it's a gateway into that constellation of practices that can offer real and substantial change on the ground for communities looking to be agents of transformation, agents of resistance to the dominant culture. It's not stuck in intellectual ghetto, so to speak, but is very flexible and can be employed and released in contexts that are rural, contexts that are suburban, and in urban contexts as well. I'm really excited to see what might happen when we draw together for a little over 2 weeks a group of people that are passionate about these concerns, and then spend that time exploring the contours of imaginative of paradigm shifts, of reskilling our hands, of reacquainting our bodies with precisely what is needed, the skills that are needed to tend to the earth in this time of need, in this time of trouble, and then seeing and hearing what people are bringing to the table from various watersheds across the continent and perhaps from around the world, what people are learning in their context that they can say, this has been working for us, these are the challenges we are bumping up against, and this is what we want to see happen where we are, and we know that that must, of necessity, be stitched together with what is going on in other watersheds around the world.
Chris, 17 days is a long time. Some of our people are thinking, wow, why does it take so long? This is an internationally vetted curriculum, right? You want to say something about that?
Absolutely, yeah. So it's been it's an internationally recognized curriculum, and by that we mean two things. First, that around the world, if you if you say that you have taken a permaculture course, a permaculture certification course, or if you have if you're offering one, it's expected that there's a certain curriculum that you'll follow that was originally outlined by Bill Mollison in the late 80s, and that can be found. It's the curriculum follows his the table of contents of the Permaculture Designer's Manual, which is sort of the magnum opus of the permaculture literature. And then secondly, the United Nations has an eco-village design curriculum that they've sort of signed off on, and that eco-village design curriculum is entirely built and structured around the permaculture design certification course, because it's a recognized approach to the design and implementation of not simply sustainable human settlements, but truly regenerative human settlements, not simply human communities that replace what they have taken from the land base and watershed in which they find themselves, but an approach that returns more than what has been taken. It's deeply regenerative across the board.
And Chris, one last question. How is this permaculture design certificate course going to reflect gospel values, and how is it going to be rooted in the Christian tradition?
Sure. Well, I think for myself, my earliest experience of the holy other, of divinity, was on a wilderness living retreat that was designed for troubled teens when I was 15 years old. And shortly thereafter, I encountered the gospel of Jesus. And I would like to, I guess I could say that for a good 5 and perhaps 10 years afterwards, I spent my time trying to explore the connections and discrepancies between those two experiences. And I feel like that's a constitutive experience of a lot of people. A lot of work has been done by great theologians, by grassroots activists, by people like you and I, to explore the ways in which a commitment to the non-human creation around us is bound up with our commitment to self-emptying love that makes manifest the reign of God in our midst. And I feel like there is I guess if I were to say, to try and crystallize it in as most succinct of a way as possible, there's a lot out there that's being taught or even well-intentioned uh, um, teaching or commitments regarding creation care that accidentally reinforce this sort of above and below or hierarchical understanding of humanity and creation. And I think one of the things that we're offering at the core of this course is a theology of human identity that is that understands that we are a part of, not apart from, creation. And that has tremendous ramifications for our embodied practices as ecclesial communities, as individuals, as nonprofits, so on and so forth. It really shapes the form and content of the ways that we engage the issues of our time, whether they be historically recognized forms of social injustice, which tend to be people tend to assume are separate from ecological issues, or ecological issues that people tend to easily or all too easily frame as a concern around or an issue of stewardship. So I think this major and deep paradigm shift that is always already a theological and an ecological paradigm shift is one of the major contributions that this permaculture design course will have to offer.
Thank you, Chris. We are really relying on everybody who's participating in this webinar tonight, all of the good folks here at Ojai Valley Community Church, to spread the word about this permaculture design course. This is a big experiment. We think it'll be the first thoroughly faith-based PDC to be offered of the dozens and dozens that are currently offered around North America. So we're hoping we can really spread that word by word of mouth. Now, one of the things that one of the things that I wrote 20 years ago when I was talking about replaced theology is that part of our task is to reclaim symbols of redemption which are indigenous to our watersheds in which our churches reside, to remember the stories of the peoples of the land, particularly the first peoples, and to sing anew the old songs. Then these can be woven together with the symbols, stories, and songs of our biblical tradition. And I believe this is necessarily a local and contextual and often very personal exercise. We have Christy Otto with us. Christy was part of the Institute last month, and I think she's considering coming to the PDC next spring. And this is Christy on one of the early morning bike rides that she took with Tim and Charlita. Tim, do we have Christy coming online? All right. Welcome.
Hey, Christy.
Welcome, Christy, coming from Fresno. Christy, could you tell us what most impacted you about the long weekend you spent with us over Indigenous Peoples Day last month?
The biggest part that was impactful for me was the focus on like eco-literacy, and what I got out of that was really needing to know my area and my current area, because it's not really I'm still getting used to Fresno being considered my home, and there's sort of a spiritual battle there that I went through for a while with God moving me to Fresno, and so it was interesting for me to come to this place of really profoundly believing that part of the work that I'm hoping to do with permaculture and however that leads into things, is to know the history that I'm working within and to know the native connections, whether it be people or injustices that were done, the plants even, so stuff like that. And so that was very profound for me, for the level of my spiritual connection of connecting this as home and starting to really learn this place and coming to know this place and loving this place, therefore. So yeah, I would say that's probably the biggest thing for me.
Now you have been studying theology, but you seem to exhibit a lot of energy coming out of the Institute last month, and you immediately set to work on some practical projects. What are some of the things that you've been getting your hands and feet involved in?
The first thing I did when I got home was I started digging up our yard. We just moved into a house that's on about, oh geez, I don't know, it might be just like 0.2 acres or something like that. Very small piece of property. And the way that the land around the house is set up for drainage of the water, it's so that everything goes to the center of the lawn. We have a ton of lawn in the backyard. Everything goes to the center of the lawn and then off to the sides of the house, and then directly out to the sewer system out front. So, and it was creating its own little water path, its own little river through our yard because there was so much runoff coming from it's been summer in Fresno, so it certainly hasn't been natural. It's just from our watering of the land from sprinklers and stuff. So I started digging and making that a little bit deeper to try to see if I could get it to reroute. And I dug some other places for the water to start going toward land that was drier and wasn't getting any kind of hydration. So I had no idea if that was a good idea or not, but I just decided that when I had left the Institute, I wasn't going to worry about things being right or wrong. I was just going to, go for it. So we have started experimenting with ideas around how to make that a little more permanent and how to integrate that into a more aesthetic desire that my parents are hoping for with their property. So creating it to be sort of like a dry creek sort of look if there was no water running through it and such. So yeah, that's where I've been getting my hands technically dirty. And then other things have just been more studying. For me, I felt like I really do need to start getting connected with places that I can learn more about Fresno's history. I found it incredibly difficult to find a connection to Native people. There seems to be quite a barrier of that because any kind of Indian land or reserves or anything is all turned into casinos. And so they're or in the process of doing such. And so it's not like a place to come and meet people, and learn about who they are and their culture. It's more of them turning land into the money resource that is available here in Fresno, which I thought was kind of surprising. You would think that land that was given back to a people who got their land taken from them might want to try to restore that land and keep it to being as native as possible. So I found that kind of surprising.
Christy, thank you. Your experience shows that, as we like to say in this work, no step is too small and no step is too large in Watershed Discipleship. And we really appreciate how you really carried that momentum right out of the Institute as an individual, doing what you could immediately. We want to bring in Joshua Grace from Philadelphia. Joshua is a pastor, and he's trying to work with a community in inner city Philadelphia on some of these same matters. Josh was with us last month, and his community has been doing a number of things already. Josh, what for you was the most important thing that you took out of last month's Institute that you wanted to sort of layer into Circle of Hope in Philadelphia?
Yeah, thanks. How's my audio, Ched? Thumbs up if it's all right. Oh, man. So, okay, I'm all right? Great. So the best thing, of course, was spending time with Ched, Elaine, and Chris. So it's quite a journey to get to the West Coast for me, but I really felt like I needed to do what I had to do to go and to get there and be with them. You know, Ched and Elaine told me I had about 40 to 45 minutes here to speak, so I'll just get right into it. Worshiping together was great. Different people led songs, shared songs. Elaine did a lot of that. We shared meals, and much of which of that was local vegetables and herbs, even from Casa Anna Schultz. And the Bundys, of course, brought a bunch of food and even fresh fish that was, free diving spear fishermen brought for us. One thing I would just say is I didn't know what permaculture was. I thought it was a series of practices or just a theory of companion plants and things like that. And Chris helped me understand that it's really a design discipline that includes practices, but it's a lot bigger of a story than just practices. And the some of the Bible stuff that was really useful for me was eschatological help about where the Old Testament and New Testament narratives are headed. And being in the Ventura River watershed, where the river is not flowing right now, and how many of those prophecies, including Revelation, have to do with a river returning, a river flowing. Now, for me, I live in the Delaware, about a mile from the Delaware River watershed. The water flowing or not isn't something I think about in terms of even the scripture of what a restored, healthy community is. So to be able to imagine that there in that particular place with those stories as a backdrop to even help me understand how significant water and the watershed particularly is to where this is all going, even into the future redemption of all things. So, to be replaced in my own area here, I have a lot of learning to do. I have some great starts, but this whole, for me and a lot of friends, this critique of civilization that Ched's helped us along with, especially, can bring us to a place that doesn't have a lot of easy answers and gets a lot of questions from others about, well, what kind of practical stuff are you doing? How are you modeling this critique? And for me, this the time that we had together at the Institute was really helpful for not just having a critique, but having that critique and taking it all the way down, as Chris said, but then also having a lot of new practical constructs and disciplines that are small enough to do now, but also big enough to grow into for the rest of my life.
Josh, in the 3 or 4 remaining minutes of your 45 minutes, can you highlight one thing that you are most excited about that Circle of Hope community is already engaged in along these lines in inner city Philadelphia?
Yeah, we About the last 7 years, we started a network of community gardens where we're and that making space for neighbors to be able to grow things and participate in that cultivation, and that's kind of moving towards a community land trust that includes affordable housing and this component of growing things. It's kind of spawning this food co-op, and that whole situation where neighbors are the major contributors and owners of the farm, and the church gets to be a group that makes space for that kind of transformation is really special. So that just reflects in, I think, a lot of the theology that we do, starting to use those local imagery and things to even consider what it means to be a church that's embodied in a particular place.
Thank you, Joshua. Joshua made some great contributions last month with music and pastoral presence. I really want to thank all three of our guests who beamed in from different parts of the country tonight. We really enjoyed having you, all three of you, out here, and thanks for the continuing work you do. I'm now going to play a little Johnny Carson up here and talk to some real live guests. Jeanette, Ben, I want to invite you up into the hot seat. And I want to ask you to talk a little bit about your work at the Abundant Table Farm Project. People hear us talk about that all the time. You guys are kind of legendary around the country, but you're the part of the newest class of interns. What is the Abundant Table? What do you all do?
Okay, the Abundant Table is an organization overall, and there's a class of interns that are associated with the Abundant Table. I'm the farm intern. Sarah over there is connected to Oxnard City Corps, and Angela works with the Community Roots Garden in Oxnard. And the farm specifically is a 5-acre organic vegetable farm that grows produce for different CSA customers and also food for Ventura Unified School District kids in the cafeterias. And the farm is equally focused on growing healthy, local, organic produce, but also and kind of working with the land in that way to keep it healthy. But also working to make sure that the people who are working on the farm, so myself and we have 3 other people, Reina, Guadalupe, and Rojas, who are former farm workers. Actually, they're still working on a farm, but they're farmers, and just making sure that everyone receives a living wage and health care and healthy food in response to working on the farm.
Now, the Abundant Table is a faith-based project. It's one of the few faith-based organic farming internships that I'm aware of around the country. It's rooted in the Episcopal tradition. What are some of the rhythms of your all's lives that have to do with developing your faith and connecting it with the work you do day in and day out?
Well, personally, working on the farm is a fairly spiritual experience inherently for me, just because I found my spirituality kind of in more of the wild spaces, and seeing now, especially here at the Bartimaeus Institute, how to take it one step further to connect God to food and to land and the place that we live in. So finding the social rejuvenation that comes from working on the farm and seeing how interactions with people on the farm is kind of inherently a spiritual experience, but also working with the land and seeing God kind of in that as well, and seeing the food go to different places that really need it, and forming these relationships through the directions where that food is going is kind of spiritual as well. But we also do a lot of discussion on land-based justice and anti-oppression here in Southern California, specifically in Ventura, where there is a lot of oppression for farm workers going on, is also a big part of our internship.
Mm-hmm. You all have a small house church. You have rhythms of prayer and Bible study. What's been the biggest surprise for you coming into this program and encountering it as a young follower of Jesus? What's been the biggest surprise for you?
Well, I think the biggest surprise for me has been, I had previously dabbled a little bit in agricultural work, but I think there's a lot of romanticism that is in the world of especially younger generations coming into the world of farming, and thinking, oh, it's so nice to pick your own food and eat it and feel healthy, and but it's really hard work. It's really difficult. It's very hard to be bent over all the time, and it's not light and breezy, doing this backbreaking work. And I think that's just a good lesson for us all to learn, that it's not easy to kind of jump in and say, I'm going to work for justice, but it's really bending over backwards and getting your hands dirty.
I know one of the passionate conversations you had both during and on the margins of the Institute with Chris was the challenge of how permaculture might relate to a 5-acre productive truck farm, which is having to fulfill CSA subscriptions and so on. What do you think the biggest challenge facing you all is at the farm there as far as permaculture goes?
Well, I think the biggest challenge is that we are a for-profit business, that first and foremost there are quotas that need to be met as far as vegetable production and getting a good product out to our customers. But I, for one, take a lot of pride in the fact that we are a for-profit business, and in that way we can kind of confront and challenge the giant industrial farms that are producing around us. So even though that is a challenge, I think that is kind of the most exciting part about it all, is that we have to balance this participating in this world that we live in such a way, but also figuring out how to weave what Chris and yourself were talking about during the Institute into the way we live and the way we produce and run the business.
Thank you, Jeanette. I want to invite your compañera, Sarah, to come up and...
I want to show this first.
Oh, yeah. Do you guys want to say anything about this beautiful box of lettuce?
I just came from a farm stand earlier today, and we didn't sell a lot of lettuce, so you guys are getting it.
Ah, the gift economy working here.
So for
awesome.
all of you that are not here physically, you all could come live in the Ojai Valley, and you would get some awesome lettuce.
Thank you. That's lovely.
Beautiful.
Come on up, Sarah. Sarah's another one of the new intern class. Sarah, each of you do work out in the community. Tell folks a little bit about the work that you do.
So I have the new intern position with the Abundant Table this year. So we're still trying to, in any new position, there's a bit of chaos as you figure out what your role is in the whole thing. But I am working to develop a discernment curriculum for Oxnard City Core, working specifically with Community Roots Garden in Oxnard. So it is a group of youth out of Oxnard who are on probation for various reasons, and their ages are 15 to 24, and working in the garden through experiential learning and using the garden setting to have the deeper conversations about what is a meaningful life and what their passions are and what it means to live in this bioregion, essentially, and how to be contributing members to that.
Now, Community Roots Garden is a very specific project that arose out of a church, a Methodist church, rethinking its property. Say a little bit about that. It's a really exemplary project.
Yeah, it's a really unique community garden in that people don't own individual plots. but we all work together in this shared space. So it's about an acre, and decisions are made communally, and all of the produce either goes to volunteers, who there's a lot of farm workers in the community who don't often get to eat the food that they help pick every day. So it's addressing that food security issue, as well as being an educational space for the youth that come into the garden. It's in conjunction with a preschool, so we get to talk to preschoolers about worms a lot, which is wonderful. And then all of our extra produce goes to either the food pantry or the rescue mission or Women's Lighthouse, which is another nonprofit in the area.
Seems like the Abundant Table really is serious about connecting food justice, social justice with watershed discipleship. That seems to be a real strong commitment.
Yeah.
You come from a really interesting watershed. What's the name of the watershed you come from, Sarah Wurst?
So I found out after the watershed weekend, I was talking to my mom because I'm from a place in Nebraska. We're like one of the 2 counties in America that doesn't have a bridge, so it's just a very arid landscape. So of course I don't even know what the nearest river is. You know, it's the North Platte, but that's a long way away. So in researching this, we discovered that the watershed that I grew up in is the stinking water watershed. As if we could make living in Nebraska any less appealing.
Pretty awesome. What do you see yourself doing? Where do you see yourself taking this as you move through this internship year? You have a real interest in studying theology.
Yes.
Suddenly now you're a community organizer. You're in a community-based farm. What are some of the challenges you think you face trying to integrate, particularly the seminary, the sanctuary, the streets, and the soil?
I think that particularly for me, there's sort of this renewed interest in studying theology in different contexts and how important it is to do that with real life experience of people as a voice to that. In a lot of ways, it feels like all of the threads of my life come together into watershed discipleship. When I was studying art in college, my senior art show, which was a series of oil paintings, was dealing with this idea of humankind, earth, and creator spirit all working together in this co-creation to create a more passionate and sharing world, which is really crazy that I'm back into all of those trains of thought after 2 years of doing service work with Jesuit Volunteer Corps, so on the Crow Indian Reservation at a school, and then working with the houseless community in Portland, Oregon, and now with my group of youth in the garden. But common threads that exist through all of that is definitely how important it is to reconnect kids, especially, to the land that they're on and all of the wonderful spiritual heart work and cultivation that comes from that. And also, I am Catholic, so I always think that there's room for improvement in my own faith tradition as far as allowing space for more women's voices. And I think that in a lot of ways, the earth and women and a renewed understanding of God is going to be a path for me, whatever my path is, I guess.
The Institute was really a rich ecumenical gathering of high church, low church, and no church, and that rich mix is always so wonderful. Thank you, Sarah.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Our last guest was able to be with us for just a little bit of the Institute. He's a professional water engineer and a very active watershed steward. Bill O'Brien is a member of this church and a good friend and a great watershed activist. Bill, you just told me at 5 a.m. this morning that these signs are going to be soon going up here in the Ojai Valley, and that's a big, small victory with lots of symbolic value. Talk a little bit about some of the advocacy to get more watershed signage up.
Well, part of living in a watershed is that most people don't know it. And so one of the ways to communicate that idea is wherever you pass a watershed divide is put up a sign, welcome to the watershed that you're going into. And Part of the advocacy thing, I think, is just persistence. It takes money to get these things together. It takes some cooperation of whose property the sign will go on. So these are a start. There's 6 of these put up by the county, Ventura County, just as part of their clean water campaign. But we worked with the county to try and get those through. So I think, this idea of raising the consciousness of what a watershed is a huge thing. And it just will take a number of people doing it a number of different ways to get through.
You're a professional hydrologist, so water engineer. It seems like you've really found a home in the watershed movement here in the Ventura River watershed. You're in some very, very important places. Not least of which is the Ventura River Watershed Council. Talk a little bit about that council, all the different stakeholders, and what the council is trying to do.
Yeah, that is a good thing to talk about. Watershed work is more than just what one guy or one gal can do. And it takes a team. It takes a big team. And everybody's wired with a purpose. I'm wired on the technical side, so I can help out that way. Not so good with the artwork or the promotion or the fundraising, but hey, other people are good at that. And one of the vehicles that came from the state of California was a set of grants that would be given to groups that could show they had integrated regional water management plans. And I think it's the right track for policy anyways, to think of integrated planning, and each watershed formed a group of stakeholders and to get this money. Okay, there was a big carrot there, and but that brought in everybody who were concerned about the beaches, the habitat for steelhead, but also the agencies. So now you had a place where the water agencies, the sewer districts could come and talk about projects that would benefit everybody. And once you got the agencies involved with the guys on the street who had the compassion, you start seeing some of the wheels change, that you can sit back and say, hey, this project would benefit the whole watershed. It's not just, something from my little silo, my little agency, but hey, this project would benefit the whole watershed. And then you communicate that to all the stakeholders and they get behind it, and then you can get some money. There's the money angle. And I think part of what most of us are trying to think of is a new economy. And that's hard for people to change. It's hard for people to give up what institutions they built over years. But this is a start. Think of integrated water management, and then using that kind of collaboration to come up with projects that really do benefit the whole watershed.
I'm really proud of the watershed activism in this watershed. It's, I think, some of the most advanced stuff happening anywhere in the country. Cities have master plans, counties have master planning, but we're now seeing the Watershed Council develop a master plan for this watershed. That's a huge step forward.
Oh yeah. That's, you just gotta pray Lorraine can keep it together. That
she's juggling lots of interests.
She's the writer of this watershed master plan, but back in 2006, a number of us recognized that we needed a watershed coordinator. And it wasn't enough that we each came into these meetings with our goodwill and ideas. We needed somebody who's focused on the watershed and tried to pull some of the resources together for it. And that was really a key thing, was setting up a position for a watershed coordinator.
One of the projects that's come out of this, and that you work with the Ojai Valley Green Coalition, is some creek restoration here in Ojai. Just maybe say a little bit about that, because that's just such a concrete demonstration project of how to restore degraded habitat.
Yeah, a number of people in town decided that the best showcase for a restoration project would be right in the middle of downtown at Libby Park. And center of Ojai, which is kind of the meeting place for everybody here. And it was filled up with blackberry vines and choked out, totally choked out. You couldn't see the water course underneath all the growth. There's a bunch of Mexican fan palms and non-native plants. So one of the guys, Brian Hawley, and a couple of his cohorts, they got a small grant just to clean up a short reach of that creek. And we had a lot of volunteer days, and got some momentum going, community awareness, good education. The kids from school came, and schools would come and help us plant or weed, and we were able to really clear out this little showcase reach of the creek. And then we were able to get follow-up grants to do more and to keep working downstream.
And it's really created a lot of civic pride, as well as environmental consciousness, because it's an educational event. What's invasive, what's native, what's healthy for the land and for the water.
And I think it was good for the city of Ojai, the Public Works Department. They saw that the people were willing to help maintain the park and make it a friendlier place and more beautiful place. And I think we have to prove to some of these institutions that are still around, that are part of the political system, that, hey, we can make a difference and here's a way to do it.
One last question for you, Bill. You're a member of this church.
Yeah.
What is your hope for this community, Ojai Valley Community Church, when it comes to some of the themes we've been talking about tonight of watershed discipleship? What's a very concrete hope you have for this community and for this campus?
Well, this campus has a lot of land, and it also generates a lot of water when it does rain. So I think it would be a good demonstration garden, pilot plant, or an example of what people can do. And the other part of this is discipleship. I'm a disciple of Jesus. I'm a forgiven guy. Jesus pulled me out of the pit when I was 17, and that, that's where, he was forgiven much, loves much. And that's what I really hope for our community, is that we love enough that we take care of our community and neighborhood and land, like this. So.
Thank you, Bill. We're glad to have a water engineer on our side.
Okay. Do what I can.
That's great. Well, we really appreciate all of our guests, both out there in webinar land and right here in Ojai Valley Community Church. We've tried to give you a little bit of a glimpse of some of the exciting convergences that are happening, both in terms of theory and praxis, around what we are calling watershed discipleship. It's a movement that is both intensely local, and you've heard some of the local things that are going on here, but it's also widespread around the country. We've got some really terrific people on the line of this webinar this week. People like Sylvia Kismat, who's a New Testament scholar and a farmer up in Ontario, Canada, who runs a farm called Russet House Farm, which is really a teaching and educational farm. We've got several young folk who are intensively studying permaculture and bioregionalism, and trying to figure out what that's going to mean for their own vocations. We've got several scholars of theology and ethics on the line with us. Church leaders. We're so excited that this is a movement that's spreading. It seems like it's a vision whose time has come. But we have lots of work to do, because the truth of the matter is that it's going to require as many generations to reclaim our sense of place as it did to destroy it. And that's sobering. What is clear is that we have no alternative. When I first started thinking and writing about this and journeying toward it in my own discipleship, 20 years ago, there were very few Christians interested in this conversation. That is changing. And that's true whether they're evangelicals, Catholics, Episcopalians, Lutherans, Methodists, Quakers, Mennonites. It's a really exciting time. And it has to be, because the times demand that of us. The conversation is shifting, but it's very urgent because we really are in an end game. So we are really calling for intentional collaboration all around North America, even Ireland, around to help us change the paradigm that have in some ways sidelined our churches on some of the most important issues of our day. We are, Brock Dolman argues, as Elaine described, we are perched on the tipping point of a watershed moment in which we have to embrace our home watershed as our lifeboat and teach others to do the same. Watershed by watershed is how we will heal the planet. There is no such thing as healing the planet globally. It can only be done one piece of ground, one watershed at a time. And of course, all watersheds are intimately connected. Permaculture teaches us the interconnectivity of all things. Our hope is that the proposal for promoting and exploring this paradigm of watershed discipleship will encourage us and equip us to embrace our watersheds as our lifeboats. Just as Jesus bid his disciples on the ancient Sea of Galilee, calling them into the boats and onto the way of discipleship, that we too might follow Jesus into the oncoming storm as watershed disciples. So we want to thank you all here and folks all around the world for joining us tonight. We do want to let you know about our next webinar and our last webinar of the year, which will be coming up on December 10th in a little less than a month. The theme is Women Protecting Babies from the Beast, Matthew's nativity story and a celebration of the Feast of Guadalupe. That may seem like a long and complicated title, but we're going to look at three things. We're going to look at the Tradition of Guadalupe, which is a very important cultural tradition to Latino communities here and should be really for all of us. It's an amazing story. It has grounding in the scriptural story, particularly the story of the woman clothed with the sun in Revelation 12 who protects innocent life from the violence of the beast. And we're going to see how that itself is reflected in Matthew's nativity story, which is about protecting kids, from the violence of kings. That's what Matthew's story of the birth of Jesus is all about. So we're going to look at all of that. We're going to do that as part of the preparation for a women's retreat that's going to be happening, and many of the women in this room are going to be part of a women's retreat, and many of us are going to be making a pilgrimage down to the U.S.-Mexico border on December 14th for the 20th annual Posadas Sin Fronteras, which is one of the most amazing recontextualizations of another Latino tradition, that of Posadas, right at the border, as a story of immigrant rights. So we hope that you will join us on December 10th for that webinar. It promises to be full of both good scripture study and cultural reflection. Well, thank you again for joining us, everybody. This is the picture of the keystone species of our bioregion. It is Quercus agrifolia, the coast live oak. And we at Bartimaeus Cooperative Ministries really feel like it is our symbol. It's how we try to stay rooted in the gospel and in this place. We know that you all are seeking to do the same thing wherever you are, at AMBS and out in Virginia and all over North America. Thank you for joining us tonight. Thanks to Tim and Charlita. And Tim has an announcement. Tim, sit down and make an announcement.
Because Chet always forgets it, follow us on Facebook.
Follow us on Facebook, and most importantly, follow Jesus into the watershed. Thanks, everybody. Good night. We're going to leave the chat function running. If you all want to chat, greetings to each other. Sorry we didn't have time for Q&A tonight, but we had so many beautiful voices in the mix.